Welcome to the Soft Network podcast. I'm your host, Chris Ostrander. If you're new here, we're a podcast birthed out of a nonprofit that serves the special operations community. And really, we just want to be a central area, a location where you can come, you can get high-level content from former operators who are sharing their transition stories, how they themselves found healing, SMEs on certain topics. You can check out some of the videos that we have. We've got some amazing guests coming up, but we're currently in a mini series looking at psychedelics, how they work, the harms of them, screeners, what does the research say, what are some of the clinicians wrestling with ethically, how are they protecting their clients. And today's guest for episode 2 is just one, an incredible person, but number 2, somebody that's been in this work for quite a long time. And so let me introduce our guest. Lyndsey Ryan is a licensed professional counselor, a licensed addictions counselor, and an advanced clinical supervisor with over 25 years of experience in trauma, addiction, and high acuity mental health care. For more than 2 decades, she has worked closely with veterans, special operations personnel, and first responders navigating combat trauma, moral injury, traumatic brain injury, addiction, chronic pain, and the complex transition out of service. Over years of clinical work with this community, she observed a recurring pattern of persistent nervous system overdrive, disruptive sleep, cognitive strain, often compounded by TBI exposure, emotional constriction, relational distance, and a loss of identity once operational intensity decreases. She recognizes that while these were highly capable, disciplined individuals, trauma therapy alone often wasn't enough to fully address the layered neurological and physiological impacts of war. And this underlying pattern appeared to be keeping the emotional pain tethered in place. Committed to better outcomes, Lyndsey pursued advanced training in trauma and somatic therapies and collaborated with medical colleagues utilizing deep brain neurofeedback, TMS, and nerve block interventions. She expanded her training into behavioral genetics, functional medicine for mental health, and the connection between trauma, neuroinflammation, and neurodegenerative conditions, seeking to understand both the psychological, and biological drivers for suffering. That search ultimately led her into psychedelic-assisted therapies, which carefully integrated with trauma-informed psychotherapy and nervous system repair. She found these approaches offered a more durable path forward for many of her veteran and soft clients. Lyndsey holds a Master of Arts in Contemplative Psychotherapy from Narup University, and she has served in executive leadership roles within the psychedelic healthcare field, developing clinical protocols and training provides in ethical, research-informed care. She remains dedicated to helping those who have carried the heaviest burdens reclaim connection, purpose, and a life that feels fully their own. Lyndsey is an incredibly genuine person. I think you're going to see that right off the bat. We had a great conversation, and this is somebody who has been practicing in this space for quite some time and really knows the ins and outs of what the individuals are going through, but also being an integration expert, I would say. She's got a wealth of information that she shares in this interview and how best to help clients approach this space when they're leaving it. We get into some questions about ethics and really what's going on at the root of psychedelics. And so I can't wait to bring this episode to you. This is episode 2 of our Psychedelics mini series, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Cool. All right, Lyndsey, thank you so much for coming in. I'm really excited. As I was talking earlier, I can't wait to unpack this subject. I firmly believe this is, I think as kids, we go through times in history where it's like you look back and you're like, what were people thinking? What was some of the things going on? And then, of course, we've all lived through 9/11, and that was pretty transformative. But for us in our field, currently the state of psychedelics is probably the most interesting topic out there for our clients, and then also for us as clinicians. And we're very early on, it feels like to me, of what we know, what we don't know. And so part of my heart in starting to have this mini series and these conversations is I have clients constantly asking me, past clients that reach out, and then clinicians that, they've got limited information here or there. And so what we're trying to do is bring in some real experts such as yourself. And at the end of the day, consolidate that into a mini series so that individuals that are looking for information and also wanting to hear some of the questions that as clinicians that we wrestle with, that we just don't know yet, and how we're handling those. That's kind of where I wanted to go with this, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me in and just for hosting this discussion. Because I think you're spot on. I mean, we're at the most, hands down, I mean, like 27 years in the field, the most pivotal time of change I've ever seen in my career. The opportunities for healing are tracking really quickly. The research is insanely exciting. The sound bites that we're hearing from folks on the back sides of these journeys is really promising. And I love that we're deepening into the discussion of, what happens after that pink cloud? What does long-term integration look like? What does a lived experience of having gone through a psychedelic journey or a series of psychedelic journeys, depending on the medicine, what does that actually look like? And how are people's lives shaped over the course of time, not just in this one moment?
Yeah. I want to ask you about your backstory and a little bit about your clinical training and how you got into the realm of psychedelics. But just for followers that maybe haven't thought through this or processed this, I'm a very, if I have a superpower that helps me clinically, it's conceptualization and that 30,000 foot view. And so the more I've learned about this topic and thought through it, one of the things that I wanted to help frame for the listeners is obviously psychedelics became illegal in the 60s and 70s. You would know better of exact date, but so psychedelics go underground in the 80s. I think with ecstasy and MDMA, the military did some experiments specifically with couples and individuals trying to understand some of the components there. But recently, through Rick Doblin, a few other people around the world, there's been a focused effort of, hey, what if psychedelics can actually help people with anxiety, with trauma, and specifically, and we're going to hit on some of that. But and then we have the emergence of great organizations like Heroic Hearts, Vet Solutions, and there's others. Those are just a few of our partners. But I want to highlight for, I think, the individuals listening to this, there was such a cloud of negativity around psychedelics culturally that these organizations, and I think specifically the special operations community, I don't know if, I mean, you can chime in on this, I don't know if there's another population within the US population that could have begin to turn the tide on, hey, psychedelics might be actually therapeutic. I'm curious if you could think of another population that we would actually listen to on this.
I don't know that there is. I mean, it's, as I often have joked, like psychedelics have become like the most purple issue under the sun, with veterans bringing this forward. And I think it really speaks to our values as a nation, right? Like we want to honor those who have served, and we have this duty and this responsibility. We've asked this of them, and asked these incredible, tremendous sacrifices to mind, body, and soul to engage in this service. And we have a responsibility for helping to support them to heal when they come home. And so I think that value as a nation, coupled with the emergence of this medicine in a time in our paradigm of a society where this actually becomes possible. It's this unique intersection that we're hitting simultaneously.
Yeah, I also think, obviously the internet and independent media plays a tremendous role because that wall of resistance or misinformation surrounding psychedelics from the 60s, 70s, the boomer generation, and then what they taught their kids, which would be me, is so high. And so this informational tsunami, if you will, that has grown around psychedelics, and specifically starting with the special operations community, and it's trickled into just veterans at large, first responders, for sure. I think it's really important for individuals to consider that there's had to be this groundswell of positivity to get to a point where we're actually investing, Ibogaine for America. They got that. I believe in. Somebody can correct me in the comments, which is fine. I think the $50 million from the state of Texas to examine it. Like we're finally at that level where we're willing to put some serious money and some serious minds behind it, which I think is so critical. But it goes to show how big that wall or that hurdle was for these programs and individuals to overcome.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, even for me, like as a person, as a clinician, I'm 3 years in on a doctorate. We were never discussing psychedelics, like never, nowhere in the course of my education did this come up. Maybe at the edge of a fringe training I took maybe 13 years ago, I was starting to hear about MAPS. I was starting to hear about MDMA, but it was so outside of my landscape. I grew up in Southern Illinois, grew up with a family history, basically everybody served, where culturally where I'm from, it's expected that everybody's going to serve. And I graduated high school in 2001. So, I'm tracking in right as 9/11 is coming on. It hasn't happened yet. But we're in this very strong military culture. My dad served in the Marines during Vietnam. He was a drill instructor. Both of my grandparents, well, all of my grandparents, both sides had served during World War II. So, just like all of this intergenerational component. And where I'm from, all drugs were bad and psychedelics were part of drugs. So it wasn't in my landscape, in my childhood growing up. I was never one of the cool kids in college. I don't know, nobody was ever like offering me shrooms or anything like that. So it wasn't in my purview. And I was a dedicated clinician, right? So I'm working in really rigorous clinical settings, and there just wasn't space for that there. But it was my veterans actually that brought psychedelics to me. So they truly, like, they have led the force, even in my own personal education. I think it must have been right around 2018. Talk about how small the world is. It was one of my clients who heard Marcus Capone on the Sean Ryan podcast. And he had come to me, he was struggling with opiate dependence, secondary to, I don't even remember, more than a dozen back surgeries. He had been in this explosion, completely altered his entire life. I actually was never even able to meet with him in person because he couldn't sit up in a car long enough to get to the office. And so, like, pre-pandemic, right? Like, we're doing telehealth because he just can't function. And so he's coming to me and saying, "Hey, I'm hearing this thing about like ibogaine. What is this?" And like, so that was really the first time any kind of a seed in that way had been planted. Started my own education around it, but I also have my own biases. I'm like, oh, these people are just out there like just wanting to get high or just like wanting to whatever. But I was ignorant. I just didn't know, I didn't know. And the need amongst the people I was treating, like the need was increasing, right? So I've been working with veterans since 2004 to varying levels. By about 2015, I would say almost my entire practice was veterans and special operators. And I've been tracking my own community, like my friends, my family members back home, and watching as people's mental health was just unwinding, seeing the start of what we now are calling operator syndrome. But like back in 2006, 2007, we had no idea what was happening. So my pathway had been working with like evidence-based practices, so working with a lot of EMDR, somatic experiencing, later weaving in IFS, PACT for couples work, but also PACT for individual therapy, deep brain neurofeedback, TMS, trying any of these interventions that I could find. And they would support folks to some extent, right? There would be a little bit of movement, a little bit of clearance, but the interventions themselves couldn't hold, and it didn't make sense to me. Like EMDR, that should be able to theoretically hold for at least a couple of days coming out of a session, was holding for maybe an hour, 2 hours, and then suddenly they're back in this like intense emergence phenomenon, in a lot of distress, a lot of overwhelm.
When you say hold for people that aren't clinicians, what do you mean about EMDR holding?
Yeah. So what that means for me is able to stay in a regulated, co-regulated nervous system state to look at whatever the topic was, whatever that incident was that we were exploring together in session, and able to still have the distance and have that workability around beliefs, right? So, I mean, we're like still in that play area of neuroplasticity, as much neuroplasticity as can be afforded, without psychedelics. Um, and so, what I was seeing was for these folks, they were presenting essentially with a treatment-resistant PTSD.
Mm.
Now we now know, like, no, that's actually a legit thing. Like, there's a change in the cell wall structure, the cholesterol layer of the cell, when folks are exposed to chronic and high stress events long enough, depending on their, genetic resiliency and other epigenetic factors. Once that cell wall structure changes, traditional activators for this protein called TrkB or TRKB, that's actually BDNF that proliferates neuronal growth. Um, Signals can't get in, whether
Mm.
those signals are mediated by therapy in the ways that we're introducing therapies, or we're trying with medication therapy. So SSRIs, SNRIs, they just can't transpose that cell wall. Um, but psychedelics have a different function. Psychedelics and psychedelic mimicking medicines have a different function, and they're actually able to transpose that cell wall, create that BDNF proliferation, and then that's when we have the opportunity to create this change. Other psychotherapies, evidence-based practices, seem to be able to do this as well, right? But it's at a much slower rate. It's like building one new neural network at a time, as opposed to utilizing the fertilizer of medicine and then having this really deep proliferation of neuronal growth. And each of those medicines seems to work at a different power. We have different levels of neuroplastic windows that are available. And how we activate those windows, I think, is really, that's where the rubber meets the road, right?
Mm.
Like, we can have these powerful experiences, whether it's in an EMDR session or a psychedelic journey. Those experiences can be deeply meaningful and gain a lot of insight and traction, but it's what we do with it on the backside. How do we further this new neuronal growth? How do we ensure that we're actually architecting in the infrastructure to support these insights, to support this change in relationship with our belief systems, this change in relationship to this experience of, what's happened, so that we can have sustainable change and growth over time, so that we're not just chasing peak experiences, but actually healing and then maintaining a new baseline from there.
So I want to pull you back because we got into the weeds a little bit there. Not that I don't want to go there, I do, but help the listeners know, and I'd be curious as well. You were in Illinois, and then where'd you end up, and how did you first end up working with individuals of the soft community? And then I'd love to hear, you mentioned the 2018, what the progression for you into learning more about psychedelics was.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I grew up in Southern Illinois. I was one of those kiddos who just knew when I was really little what I wanted to be. I knew I wanted to be a therapist when I grew up. And so everything just tracked towards that. I started surveying graduate programs when I was 15. And
You were
yeah,
that kid.
I was that kid. I was that kid. But I couldn't find anything I liked. Like, everything
Mm.
I checked out, I would sit in and audit these classes at these different universities. And I mean, what I can now name was that it felt like just the soul of the work was missing. Like,
Mm.
what I was witnessing felt very programmatic. Make sure that you give this many responses. Did you nod this many times? It felt very rote, and that didn't make sense to me. And so while I had this desire to be a clinician, I wasn't really finding the pathway for training that was going to work. So I took my undergrad years and studied everything. I took 7 years and I just studied everything. So I did pre-medicine work, deep studies in biology and understanding functional systems, psychology, philosophy, sociology, art, and religious studies. And I really just wanted to understand, like, how do we make sense of the human experience? How do different schools of thought make sense out of what this being human really is? It was leading me down the path ultimately of behavioral genetics at that time. And I hit a tipping point. It was a milestone after traveling. I was a religious studies student, grew up in a very strong Christian family. I was sexually abused within the church and actually left the church as a result of that, and had moved into studying more Buddhism and Eastern philosophy as another pathway in to stay connected to spirit, connected to God, but in a way that was a way that I could tolerate and be in relationship with. And so I'd been training in Zen Buddhism and had just traveled through Japan with some friends, and we were visiting temples. And one of the girlfriends and I were having a coffee after we returned, and she was starting a new life and just trying to figure out, what happens next. And she was asking for advice on, what should I do? Where should I go? And it's like, oh, I'm reading this book by this guy that started this school somewhere in Colorado, like Boulder, I think. And she was wanting to study eco psychology. And I'm like, I would imagine, like, it feels like it's probably that kind of a place. So we hopped on the desktops at the coffee shop, and she was on one, I was on the other, and just for fun. I mean, I had already accepted my doctoral position in Holland at the New School to study behavioral genetics. I was going to be looking at gene editing. This was like 2006, looking at gene editing around SPMI, severe and persistent mental illness. Like, can we edit genes that can downregulate the possibility of presenting with schizophrenia? Can we change this? What's actually functionally possible? So I'm, going down that track, but I thought, they have a psychology department. Like, I'm really liking this book by this guy, so I might as well check it out and see what lands. And I was only halfway through the copy on the page and knew, like, this was my home. Like, this was the clinical training program that I've been looking for all this time. So I went to Naropa University for my master's program in contemplative psychotherapy, and was ever so grateful. I mean, hands down, the greatest gift I ever given myself. I would say the only other gift that I've given myself at this stage that would have been greater would have been Ibogaine. Those two completely have changed the course of my life. And in Naropa, I really learned how to be the embodied psychotherapist that calling had always been there for. I just didn't know how to integrate that in, or how to rise up into that clinician that I wanted to be. And Naropa really honored and honed that container for me, so that I was able to find my voice, find my clinical perspective, and really marry everything that I had come to know about the reverence of the soul and the reverence of the human experience alongside clinical frameworks that were solid and structured. It's just beautiful. It allowed me to step into my career in a brand new way. You'd asked about working with veterans and in the soft community. I actually got started working with veterans in 2004 when I was in my undergrad work in Minnesota. Excuse me. It was right after first waves of Marines were starting to come home, and the call was just there in the university. Like, there was so much need. Folks were coming back. They were trying to go to school, and they were having meltdowns. Things were just, sensory overloaded. Everything was just way too overwhelming. And I just wanted to help. So I helped to design a sensory safe space that was there on campus. That was like, think more like, like low lighting, like very, very gentle spaces, sound therapies that are available, soft corners where lights are low, and people that you can just come and connect with. And it doesn't have to be anything big. It doesn't have to be anything serious. There's just always a spot to come and land and regulate and be in relationship and know that you can just be okay. Even if everything else doesn't feel okay in this moment, you can be okay. And that was really born out of it was a New Year's Eve conversation that I had. I was super shy, but I was at this New Year's Eve party and promptly ducked out the back, because that's what I do. I give an Irish goodbye, and went out back. And there was a veteran who had been home on deployment, and he lived next door. And he was sitting out on his back porch. And I was a smoker at the time, and he was smoking. And we ended up sitting outside till the sun came up. And he was telling me about all of his experiences and what life was like, how hard things had been. And it was right around that time Bush had just made a change where you could be in your bachelor's degree for psychology and still get to go in as a counselor. Like there was an exception that was made, and I was at this career place of like, okay, do I enlist or do I try to serve back home? Because again, like everybody in my family served. Like I also felt that call. I just didn't know how to serve best. And that conversation really shifted things for me. He's like, it can't be there. We can't open up there. We can't get vulnerable there. Like, please build something here. We've got to have something that we can come home to. And so I took that message and I ran with it for the next 22 years. I worked with veterans, whether it was in the court systems, working in community mental health, inpatient psych. I was in Colorado, I was one of the first full-time therapists that was part of the police ride-along program that we started back in 2013. So just a lot of like on the ground experiences where I could just meet veterans where they were at, really understand what was happening. And then that education folded into my psychotherapy practice once I moved into psychotherapy full time. That opportunity came through the Headstrong Project when they came to Colorado back in 2017, and then they expanded into the SOF network. I don't know the formal SOF network, but they started working with special operators shortly thereafter, and then I specialized there. So over the course of my career, I'm a trauma specialist, attachment specialist, licensed addictions counselor, and really try to just work at this intersection between psychotherapeutically what's happening alongside medically what's going on. Because that's really what I started seeing by the time I was maybe, I don't know, 2015 or so. It was clear what I was seeing in presentations. Like it wasn't just mental health, right? Like this, what we're now calling operator syndrome. Like it wasn't just PTSD that didn't relent. It wasn't just suicidal ideation that would literally start out of nowhere. I mean, like that was perhaps one of the most bizarre markers that I saw was watching someone move into that state. Someone I had been treating, like historically, had never had a suicidal thought in their life. Never. Had never been a part of their profile, never even a loose, fleeting thought. And I'm I'm thinking of one person in particular where he calls me one day and he's like, and now it's happened. He had been like stacking with the insomnia for weeks into months. The migraines were getting worse. The, capacity to like focus sensory wise was getting worse. His ability to track in school was diminishing. And then just one morning, he woke up out of nowhere for the first time in his life, and all he wanted to do was die. And I was seeing this more and more and trying to understand like what would have to be happening, like physiologically, psychologically, systems wide. What would have to be true for this to be true? And that's when I started crossing into integrative medicine and functional medicine for mental health to try to understand like, are there interventions that we can do in terms of like detox pathways? Are there interventions that we can do in terms of nutritional supports, hormone regulation, sex hormone regulation, stress hormone regulation? Like, what can we modify? If it's not just the psyche, it's not just the consciousness living in the body that's experiencing this, but it's also impacting the body as well. Where are the crosswalks and how do we start trying to tease it apart? So that's eventually what led me to the medicine space. It was my clients coming in and nothing's working. We're trying every med under the sun, every treatment that should work, and nothing's holding. And also at the same time, like in Colorado, I guess this was 2019. The other possibility, the thing that made it possible here was that Medicaid started covering ketamine assisted therapy. So people actually had access to medicine and it was insurance covered. And so there was this small subgroup of vets that I was working with who were like, yeah, I want to try whatever I can try. Like I can't keep living like this. The first gentleman I sat down, it was such a beautiful experience. I mean, this man, he was 27. He was 3 years out of service. He had had an administrative role in service, so never experienced combat and didn't identify with any military, related trauma. did have a history of major depressive disorder, treatment-resistant depression, and had had passive suicidal thoughts since he was 5 or 6 years old. Both parents had TRD, both parents had struggled with suicidal ideation, so we knew there was a strong genetic component. And gosh, for this sweet man, like, I mean, just nothing had been working. He had been out of service 3 years. He was struggling with being able to attend school. We were having to medically withdraw him every semester. He was struggling with being able to work. He trying every med under the sun. Nothing was really touching anything. And I mean, he was at risk of like homelessness at this point. You know, I mean, just all of the supports, everything is just kind of falling and nothing's working. And I'm a data nerd, so I'm always doing testing. So before he went down, he did a Beck's depression inventory and scored 63, high end of the scale, top end of the scale, severe major depression. It had been pretty reliably scoring, you know, in the 60s with his BDI in the time that I've been seeing him. Chris, I kid you not, we did a post assessment the day after his ketamine session. He dropped from a 63 to a 3 or 5. It was something like that, like
Wow.
no longer qualifying for a diagnosis. And he never went back into one. We started using like data measured ketamine work so that we were consistently tracking. He did his 6 sessions with the ongoing integration. And then I used data to keep tracking when he would start to slide back into a diagnosis so that we would know when to capture the maintenance window, because that's really the key feature with ketamine. It is perhaps like less powerful if we're considering like the depth of the power of this as individual journey itself, like ketamine compared to like ibogaine or something like that. The intensity of the journey is much less. The window of neuroplasticity is much less. So it's, you know, a number of sessions that are often needed to help really retrain and teach the neural pathways in a new way, to restabilize those stress and sex hormones more effectively, and really start remodulating the system around it. But I work with a database strategy so that we're constantly tracking so that we know, you know, okay, I'm starting to slide back in. We don't have to wait for the conscious mind and for things to start getting rough before people are coming back. But what I found is when we do that pretty consistently, like with ketamine in particular, you know, maintenance might be every 3 weeks to every 3 months for like the first year. But then after that first year, it really starts tracking out pretty reliably. So now I'm 7 years out since starting with ketamine work. And I mean, I'll still get like Christmas cards and, you know, check-ins from folks from time to time. But generally speaking, like once we're through the big bulk of the work, whatever that looks like for their treatment plan, what they're bringing in, with ongoing integration practices, people tend to be able to maintain this fairly reasonably over the course of time. And it's just been, as a clinician, it's incredibly promising. You know, I mean, nothing I knew to do was helping this man make
Yeah.
that kind of a shift. Now, over 4,000 dosing sessions later with ketamine, like really reliably seeing like this is possible. And it takes a dedicated treatment plan, a really solid therapeutic alliance, excellent prep work, excellent integration on the backside. But healing really is possible. And for the first time in my career, you know, working with folks on the tight end of the spectrum of trauma and high stress events, like that's just revolutionary for me.
Yeah, I want to point out a couple of things, and then I want to pivot and ask you a question. So I think one of the important things for individuals that aren't in the know, one of the biggest assets of ketamine is, unlike let's say ayahuasca, ibogaine, which I could be wrong with ibogaine, but specifically with ketamine, you can, the treating physician or medical personnel can turn it up or turn it down in session, which helps keep individuals safe. And also there's feedback. Side note, I don't know why I needed to throw that in there, but I was thinking through, because I generally get questions from students of like, hey, how come ketamine's legal? And, you know, it's psychedelic light-ish. But I wanted to come back to you in this stage, and I'll couch it with, so similarly in around, I think it was early 2019, like January of 2019, I was working with a former operator who had been med boarded. and um, some of his old teammates had been reaching out and saying, "Hey, you should try this thing. You should try this thing." But everything you just described, as far as treatment resistant, this individual was masking everything with alcohol, but like there was a wall between him and I. Like now we had built a therapeutic alliance, but I think your description was very similar to mine in that when this individual, and he went down and did ibogaine and 5-MeO, I think it was in January of 19. When he came back, instantaneously he was different. I mean, the way he spoke, the mood, everything, his affect was changed. You know, I know it's somewhat of a cliche, and as clinicians, we like to be a little more data driven and specific, but we are human beings, and quite literally, his eyes were open, and his ability to communicate, articulate, and not be in that very, very dark space that I think a lot of clinicians that have either unfortunately lost clients to suicide or know that they're actively suicidal. And, you know, you're doing everything, you're throwing them at the, you know, the kitchen sink at them as far as treatment. Very, very similar. So that was my introduction likewise. And so I bring that up to say at that point, it was so new to me. And so, I had so many questions. And I think this is one of the things that you could help fill in some blanks with your journey, but also what, you know, speaking to clients or future clients that may watch this or spouses, at the time there was no system. And I mean, we're slowly getting there, but there was no system for me to adequately hand him off. It was, hey, I'm going, there's some coach that's taken this, and there was very little communication of, hey, be mindful of this, this, and this. We've identified these as triggers. There was no opportunity for that. And likewise, I was taking the client's, you know, subjective experience from ibogaine and 5-MeO, and then he was relaying a little bit of some of his experiences. And I've talked with other clinicians, and this has been a concern as well. It's part of the reason we partnered with some of these organizations to clean up some of this communication gap. But, you know, hey, whatever's happening in treatment, and any start of integration coaching on the back end, relaying that. And so I'm curious from your perspective, you know, you've got this individual that you worked through with ketamine. Where are the systems at to clean up some of that miscommunication? But also, what have you seen that's been most effective as individuals? And I'm going back to your story, like how you got into that space and working with other practitioners, because it's a team sport. It really is.
Oh, it totally is. And has to be, and really has to be. I mean, I think where we're at in the space right now and what you're naming, you know, the communication between systems and how do we support for best safety, best outcomes. I think that's really the task that we're set to pick up next. I think that technologically, you know, we were talking about like social media and like the news and empowerment through education, right? Like so much of the way that this information is getting out now is happening so fast. So everybody and their brother's hearing all about it in like rapid speed, and it's tracking faster than the systems have been able to organize themselves around. And so we have more people coming to medicine, they're learning about it so much faster, so much earlier, as an earlier intervention possibility. And absolutely, I mean, I don't think these medicines should be a last resort. You know, and they have very effective intervention power for unique and specific cases that literally nothing else that we have can touch. Nothing else that we know how to do can do what some of these medicines can do in specific indications. And that doesn't mean that we need to be outpacing like our structures and our safety components, because I think we're hitting the other side of that tipping point where when there's not good collaboration amongst providers, there's not shared line of sight, you know, we're not really ensuring that the person that we're holding in this experience is being well held in the experience. It's not just about having an experience, but walking them through an experience and on the other side of it. I think that's really where the risk comes in.
Lynn, can I jump
But
in there for a second?
please, yeah, please.
On the safety protocol. So I'll go back to that original client. To my knowledge, the only screening that he did, and of course he had conversations with the coaches, so maybe it wasn't relayed, but to my knowledge, the biggest screener he had specifically was, I think, an EKG and maybe a blood test. I could be wrong, but it was so. Walk us through what is ideal when, if somebody's going to go do ibogaine, or even considering ketamine, right? Ketamine's legal. There's a lot of ketamine clinics that have popped up in the last 5-10 years. What kind of indicators should clinicians, should spouses, should individuals that are interested in potentially pursuing psychedelics or ketamine as a therapeutic approach, what are some things that they need to be aware of for history and being able to dialogue with either the clinician, the coach, or a physician?
Yes. Well, I think it's twofold. I think that on the one side, we're talking openly about the medical protocols, right? So, like, yeah, common protocols for like an ibogaine screening are exactly that. It's EKG, a series of labs, and then those end up getting repeated, usually on site as part of those protocols because labs can change, and cardiac presentation can shift. What I don't think we're talking about strongly enough yet as a community are what are the psychological risk factors and how do we work with psychological acuity? I think so often, and I think it's just a culture, the function of our culture. Like historically, psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy, like they were one thing. And then, in the early mid 1900s, they became two different fields. There became the mental health side of things and then the medical side of things. And we created this like difference, or almost like we're separating out this part of the person of like, oh, here's their medical health and then here's their mental health, and it's still the same one person. And so like I think we've done a huge disservice in that, and I think we're seeing that most come up in this crux of psychedelic medicine because it is this medicine component. So there's this medical lens of like, yep, here are the things we need to be medically looking at for medical safety, but it isn't just the medical safety. There's a whole person with a whole story, a whole history that's coming in. And, these medicines, like when I talk about ibogaine and I work with, clients I'm coaching through this process, I really try to make sure that they're aware, like this is an earthquake that is going to rock every cell on every level, mind, body, and soul. And so we might be considering coming in for, in one of the areas with ibogaine that I work within is in neurodegenerative illness. So folks with Parkinson's and MS and Parkinsonian like presentations and other just like, currently undiagnosed neurological mixes. And so people will come in with this idea of like, oh yeah, I'm going to treat my Parkinson's or I'm going to treat my MS, and staying very focused on it from this like medical lens, not recognizing or even perhaps knowing how to start opening up to this possibility that it's not just a medical treatment. This isn't just like going in for a deep brain stimulator or something like that. It's going to open up all aspects of the profile of the self. And as clinicians, we have to be aware of that, and we have to be able to support making sure that clients, as they're considering these medicines, are one, well prepared to recognize that. Because I think there can be this belief, and I don't, this is just something I've observed. I don't really know yet exactly where it comes from for folks or like how this forms, but almost like there's this such a deep compartmentalization or this belief that like, oh yeah, I am going to be able to will my way through. And it's like, no, I'm not going to go to those places, or I'm not going to allow, those parts of my history to open. And in medicine, we don't have that kind of control. Like it really is about being able to surrender to all that arises. And even if it's the things that we don't think we should be looking at or don't want to look at, like those often are the very things that do come forward. But then on the other side of things too, I think it's also recognizing that a lot of what does come up is this really early developmental trauma component. So many people are talking about, especially veterans in the podcast, and they talk about it in Waves of War as well. There's this idea that like, oh, it's going to be all combat stuff. It's all going to be like what I did, what I didn't do, what I saw. And it's not actually that. Like, that's not the seed of it. And it's one thing I really love about the way that Ibogaine works. It's like a strong father. It's like shows this mirror and says, look over here. Like, here are the places and ways that you're getting in your own way. Here are the ways that you're just like organizing around this wrong. You're not looking at this quite right. Like, let's go take a look. But I also feel the presence of like the most loving mother also coming in to say, like, and you don't have to walk it alone. Like, I'm right here. You can always ask for help. We can always try to walk through and talk through how to do this differently over the course of the journey. And I think that people come in with this awareness of like, these medicines aren't there to, kick your ass or like, throw you off. Like, it's not that. It's really like they're there in service to try to help you heal, to help you see the things that are holding you back, the ways that you might be getting in your own way. I think, it creates greater surrender. But being able to walk folks into that, whether it's as a clinician, as a clinician, it's really helping people understand, like I know you may not consciously think right now that what happened way back then is what's going to come up, but I need you to be prepared that it's quite likely that that is what's going to emerge. We just know over the course of like all of these folks going through this experience, this is fairly reliably what shows up. And then how do we prepare for that? Because I think that's the risk factor on the backside, is the destabilization that can come from having exposure back into these experiences, these memories, but also on a physiological level. We're reopening these frozen eddies of memory that are stored throughout the body. And we're getting access into those emotions again, to those felt sensations again. And for some folks, I mean, I know for myself, when I went through the medicine, like, I hadn't had access into some of those states in more than 35 years. Like, the trauma that I had endured as a kiddo was just so significant. I walled all that off. And so as that channel is opening again, it's like my 40-year-old self feeling the 5-year-old intensity, and that can be really destabilizing and overwhelming for folks. And if people don't know that is quite possible to come through, they may not take integration quite as seriously. They may not recognize, like, no, these are the things that can be coming downstream. It's not just what happens in the journey. It's not just in those first 2 weeks or first month coming out of the medicine. It's what this medicine will grant access to over the months up to a year to come. And how do we prepare around that?
So I want to throw out just some clarifying language for individuals. Typically in the psychedelic space, when you're talking about working with psychedelics, there's 3 phases. There's the preparation phase. This is before treatment. There's the treatment phase, and then the integration phase, where we're taking what we learned or was revealed or what opened up and beginning to integrate those or grieve those losses into the individual back in the here and now. I got to ask this question because I know it's burning through my head, and I know it burns through so many other people's heads because I hear the feedback. Why does so? I'm going to do the bad counselor move and give you 2 questions, double question you. One, is there a consciousness behind psychedelics? Because so many people talk about medicine. I'm not saying you are or believe that, but you even just described it almost as a person. And so I think this is where not the skeptic in me, but maybe the educator in me wants to be like, okay, what is going on here? Why are people talking about it? Is it just, and I mean, no harm in this, if this is you by any stretch, but like, is this like the very hippy dippy or woo woo language coming in, or is there something deeper going on? And I asked that very purposely for a couple of reasons. One, I think people need to understand most grad school programs do not teach faith integration. I happen to teach at a institution where we're faith-based and we teach ethical integration. And I think it's really, really important personally, because a lot of things come back to people's worldviews. And in therapy, you end up wrestling with some of those, or the client does rather.
Yeah.
Specifically with psychedelics, like you mentioned, so many early experiences are brought up. And so, yeah, my question wants to be, hey, in your experience, is there a consciousness behind this, or why do we speak, and I say we, including myself, why do we speak in such ways where it seems like the medicine has a motive or its own ideals, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, truthfully, I have no idea, right? Like, I have no idea. I am personally looking forward to seeing what's on the other side, like after this life, and see what was that? What is this? What is this actually? What I've experienced, what I've witnessed, is that the medicines that I have sat with and served, they each hold a different kind of container, and they open different access into different states and ways of being. So like, I don't know, for anybody who's heard me talk about ketamine, like I'll often describe ketamine like it's like it creates a container of like an amphitheater, but it doesn't necessarily feel like it has a spirit to me. So like it's almost like it creates this like amphitheater where we can go and project and explore and examine, you know, whatever comes up, whatever images come up, whatever knowings come up, whatever memories come forward, but that you basically have a lot of flexibility in how you walk the space, how you navigate it. There's a lot of choice. There's a lot of choice and freedom in that. Versus the container that I feel with psilocybin with folks is more like a little kid energy is how it feels to me when I'm with people in that space, where it's just like it can be poppy and bright and high energy, and relational. You know, I think like a lot of people have spoken to me about like the relationability and the feeling of like connecting with nature, connecting with God through nature, in the course of their psilocybin experience. Ibogaine for me, honestly, I just, mm, Ibogaine for me brings forward such deep reverence. And I don't know. I don't know if that is tapping into my own depth of reverent nature. Is that amplifying my own lived spiritual experience into that space? Is that a spirit of the medicine itself? I mean, if you ask the indigenous cultures who use this as their medicine, that is their pathway to God. It is a doorway. It's not the medicine itself that is, it is, you know, the piece, but it's the key that opens the door, that creates the access. But I mean, the ways that I've seen and experienced Ibogaine in my own journeys, I've had three flood doses with Ibogaine, and I've been microdosing for my own MS recovery over the last 2 years. I've did the math recently. I've now had the equivalent of 50 flood doses of Ibogaine over the course of this time. And so I've developed a deep relationship with the medicine. And what I mean when I say, like, what does that mean, right? It sounds really woo. So what does it mean to have a relationship with the medicine?
I don't talk about my Adderall that way.
Yeah, totally. I talk about my coffee that way.
Yes, that's a great point. That is a drug, and at the end of the day, we do talk about it like that.
Yeah, totally, right. And it's, I mean, what I've learned in this, the experiences that I've had. I mean, in my last journey, Chris, it's, as a therapist, you're totally gonna, you know, get this. Ibogaine in the journey itself came through, or my experience of it came through as a Jungian psychotherapist. So my journey opened with the death, the tarot card death, coming in and saying, you know what, we're going to keep the lights down low. You don't have to look at any of this. We're here to clean this up. You've already walked through all of this. And then I kid you not, for the next 6 hours, Ibogaine narrated my trauma history like a developmental trauma therapist, telling my story, things that I consciously didn't remember aspect, you know what I mean? So it's like what is it pulling from? Is it aspects of my own memory that have been, just disenfranchised or disconnected? But there's a knowingness that I've experienced in that space that I've never experienced in any other kind of medicine or any other kind of psychotherapy. Um, don't know how to name that, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really important to pause here, because I think most people, and even our society, even a precursor or a caveat, my general perception of America, you and I are roughly the same age. I'm a little bit older, but in the early 2000s, I would say the idea of atheism was very strong and really soaked throughout our medical field, as well as our field in particular. I mean, like you said, I think technically we're kind of a part of it in a way, for sure.
Yeah.
And this is just myself, like my own perception. I think more of America is open to the idea, or coming back to the idea of, hey, I don't know what's out there, but there's something out there. There's too much evidence that supports that there's something out there. Now, we can all argue what that is. That's for another day, for another podcast. But I think what's really interesting is you've got, and this gets into some ethical stuff, but you've got the indigenous individuals that have used some of these medicines in their own ceremonies, in their own cultures for hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years. And they view it as, a doorway into either allowing the divine or something from the spiritual realm to interact with them. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard personal clients, but then also through the network we have of other clinicians, talk about people that were staunchly atheist or agnostic. And then this experience really opened their eyes to know there is something out there. And so without getting into faith and what people believe, but this is the intersection. Like, this is a really, really important part, because when people's faith and worldview is being exposed through a treatment, and these are highly traumatized individuals, sometimes, not always, but traumatized individuals, they're also in a very vulnerable state. Yes. And so how clinicians speak and how doctors and coaches speak about what the medicine is, I think is extremely, and like, I can't emphasize this enough, extraordinarily important, because you could alter or what we call I'm completely blanking, basically project your view of what's happening in somebody's experience, or your perception or worldview into them at a very critical moment. But I don't want to negate, there's, I personally believe that it is a doorway to what and to who, I don't know. The benefits of it, as you've seen and I've seen, I think are undeniable at this point. And I have tongue tied today, requires a deep investigation from us. Because if we're going to take this tool and refine it, I don't know if it needs refinement. I think the systems around it rather need refinement. We have to have some of these conversations and acknowledge what's at stake.
Absolutely. Well, and spot on. I mean, it's the very ways that, like, it would be therapeutic bad behavior, like as a therapist, right? Just in traditional talk therapy, for me to be framing your experience for you, for me to be saying, this is what you went, like verbalizing it and naming it and blocking it in, that risk just amplifies in medicine, right? Because we've pulled down this default mode network, we've made the entire subconscious and the nervous system available and open. And so really being able to recognize that this is about helping someone elicit their own meaning making, their own framework. And that can be uncomfortable and that takes time. It takes time to figure out, especially if we're connecting with faith or something bigger than ourselves in a way that we've had no historical framing for. Like I'm thinking of like clients that I've worked with who have no religious or spiritual upbringing, and then they go into, a psychedelic experience, and now they're faced with like, oh crap, okay, it's something. What is that?
Right.
And like, and that can create an existential crisis for folks. And how do we support them through that in being able to make sense out of not does what it means to me, because it doesn't matter what it means to me. That's not what matters. What matters is like how does this show up in your body? How does this show up in your meaning making, in your story, in your conceptualization of what the world is and how you belong within it?
Right.
And I think that if we're leaning in from that lens, it's very, very possible for people to develop a beautiful relationship with whatever that is for them, and however they've come to frame it and experience it. And we do tremendous disservice. It's almost like the image I keep seeing in my mind is like this beautiful what is that? It's like this beautiful opportunity that we just mask over. We just like suffocate it out. We prevent this person from being able to really live and breathe and feel what this gift is that they've actually experienced. If we come in and say, nope, this is what it is, like you don't get to know what it is.
Right. Yeah, when we project our beliefs into someone else's psyche at a time when they are extremely influential, it's unethical. If you're a licensed clinician, yes. I would say if you're a coach, it's unethical.
Yes.
But we're robbing them. If we just want to look at their experience and what's happening, we're robbing them the exercise or the intervention of wrestling with what they just experienced and coming to their own conclusions. One of the things I've just hammered to different individuals is like, if we want to get ibogaine to a point where the Mormon housewife, I grew up in Wyoming, not too far from Boulder, and there's a large contingent of Mormons in there. But if you want to talk to the Mormon housewife that's been raped at whatever age and now is considering this type of treatment, the language kind of has to change to a certain degree, or we really need to clean up the system around what happens to the individual when they're exploring their faith, because ideally, in a perfect world, they can sit across from a clinician and explore it within their view of Mormonism.
Absolutely.
And make it as clear and sharp and as bright as they need it to be, so that their healing and wholeness can take place, so that they can be a better wife, a better mom, a better individual, and even follower of their faith system.
Yes.
And I think at the heart, I will say, I think at the heart of the people that I've worked with in this space, this is their intention. I don't know if the training there is the system and guardrails for that system are there yet.
Yeah. And I don't know that they are yet. I think this is really like the next piece that we have to pick up. I think similar to, like we were talking about earlier, technology is moving quickly, word of mouth is moving quickly, levels of education to the general public way faster than historically would have been. Yeah, correct me if I'm off on this stat, but I believe it's in general with mental health, 17 years from the time research is like demonstrating a new pathway, a new whatever, 17 years before the community has actually picked it up and integrated it in as part of like ongoing mental health care. Gratefully, it's a little bit less for medicine. I think it's like 10 years for medicine from research to like the consultation room. We bypassed all of that, like with psychedelics. We we moved through this so much more quickly. Population became educated. Everything started moving really fast, and we haven't designed systems that can fully support this yet. I think And there are a lot of different camps, right? Like there's the above ground world versus the underground world when
Let's
it
talk
comes to
about that, just so
psychedelics.
people know what that is.
Yeah, yeah. So this idea of like the underground versus the above ground, right? So the underground is really the framework where I would say they would say most people would say like most of the psychedelics work was really taking place up until very, very recently.
Mm-hmm.
You know, these medicines have been scheduled since 1970, and have not been available in the, you know, in the market for mental health care, right? So the people were accessing them illegally and then working with providers who were trained, you know, in whatever ways that they were trained. Sometimes it was formal education, like a coach, you know, like a medicine training. Sometimes it was maybe doing mentorship under a shaman or another medicine provider, somebody who had been working in the space. But people had just different informal ways of providing access to this work. And it's just an area that's never been regulated. I mean, that's just naturally part of like the underground, if you will, versus above ground, which is where basically like we're working with more clinical protocols. We're utilizing, it's usually licensed clinicians who are doing that piece of the work. So we're bringing in our lens of clinical training, our frameworks, regulations, and lending that over into our work as we work with folks, you know, preparation, treatment, and then integration. So there's just different ways of being in this space, and both carry, yeah, I think both carry their own wisdoms, but and then both have their own blind spots. And I think it's once we can actually have ways of having these conversations together, and I think it's happening more and more. Like I've definitely seen the changes even just in the last couple of years, where these conversations seem to be more accessible. And I don't think we're fully there yet, obviously. You know, I don't think we're to a place where we can have these conversations super openly, because there can be very different ideas and philosophies around what is best practice,
Mm.
what is safest practice. Like what are we really even doing here? You know, what are we doing here?
Yeah, one of the things I've said to my students, but also to some of my clients, and it is what it is, but it's helpful to name it. We're in the wild, wild west to a certain extent, in that ideally something works, there's enough interest in it, and then there's research done, and then on the back end becomes, hey, what actually works about this new widget in therapy? And then more studies come out, and then it's adopted as evidence-based, and it's documented, and now it's taught in the schools.
Yeah.
And we are at it works. And
Right.
studies are examining what the medicine is doing, not necessarily what the clinicians are doing, what the coaches are doing. I mean, we're in the very, very early stages of all that.
Yes.
And I think people need to understand, you know, as clinicians, you're stuck with, hey, if something's working and there seems to be efficacy and my client is dead set on going, how do I best protect them,
Yeah.
prepare them, work with coaches and or facilitators of treatment
Yeah.
to make this as safe and hopefully therapeutic as humanly possible, but very little known about, well, should I be doing EMDR in the back end? Should I be doing
Mhm.
person-centered therapy? Should I be doing brief solution focus? Like,
Yeah.
there's so much unknown. And I just want to set the stage and say that's where we're at. And providers are grappling with that. Same thing with the coaches, I would argue as well. They may have a specific training, but like to your point, everybody has their own kind of flavor or version of approaching a client.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and I would say that like in terms of, you know, best practices backside, I mean, I think it really comes down to what, you know, it's using our clinical mind again, right? Of like which tools best match like the presentation that's coming forward, and having that flexibility to be able to move within the skill sets. But I think it also depends on the medicine, and it depends on the window that we're looking at. You know, I think we've kind of been touching on this, kind of talking around it. But there is such a thing as dark neuroplasticity. Is this a term that you've heard before?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, like we've been talking about this in the ketamine space for a while, and we can see it so much more amply there, I think, because ketamine is just more accessible, it's more available, more people are hearing about it. But I mean, having that awareness that, like, what is our environmental situation? What are people coming home into really, really matters. Because if we're coming back into the same environment that was, leading to so much of the distress, so much of the trauma, all that we're going to do is re-cement in those pathways as opposed to creating a possibility or opportunity for other pathways. So I would say, like, some of those early clinical components are, what does the support system look like? What does the home environment look like? Is there something in the home environment that you're actively trying to change as part of this medicine journey? And if so, how are we really consciously planning around that? I mean, if coming home is World War III every single day, we probably should consider, like, some other options
Right.
for how we're going to stage this, because the chances of World War III still happening when you come home is still a possibility, because it's a systems issue that changes over time, right? Like, it's not just we send this one person off for treatment, they get the magic dust and suddenly, like, they're a whole new person. Like, I don't know. I heard somebody else in an interview. I can't place even who it was right now, but, like, somebody else in an interview who said, like, was it, am I still the same old schmuck? Yeah, I'm still the same old schmuck. Like, like, it's, the medicine can help, like, break up patterns of behavior, ways of thinking, really entrenched neurobiological processes, stress hormone responses that are habituated over time, addiction components that are really, really entrenched, trauma that's really entrenched. And we're still us, right? Like, we still come home as the person that we are. We may get a better idea of who that is, maybe for the first time or the first time in a really long time, but it's still who we are. And so, what is the environment that we're coming back into? Who are we that we're coming in as? Like, who am I stepping in here and saying, like, this is what I'm working with, and this is what I'm really ready to let go of? Like, how honest are we in that aspect of the process? Like, each of these factors, I think, really matters. And then, of course, like, on that higher acuity side, where the those firm, like, red lines of, like, yeah, no, this probably, like, medicine may not be right now, or this medicine may not be the safest medicine for the presentation, either because of psychological risk factor by history, medical risk factor by history, or some combination of the two. But I think we just need more rigor in how we're approaching this and exploring this, so that we can have a better idea of safety guidelines.
One of the things I was going to add to that, excuse me, it sounds like you're saying very similar. I was actually talking with my students about this just the other day. Young clinicians see, somebody comes in, oh, they've got trauma, like, bang, we need to do trauma therapy. Let's do some EMDR. And it's like, no, like, the first thing we have to do is assess and do a really good assessment of the individual.
Yes.
But to your point, outside, because if this individual's got a, no support network, they're, a loner, nobody's really checking in on them, like, you're basically their best friend as their therapist. And I don't mean that in, like, an unethical way. I mean, just you're their only real support system. Most people would agree that's probably unethical to crack them open. Forgive the layman's term, or just casual comment there, but, like, open up their trauma for an hour or maybe 2 hours and then send them home for a week. But there is this summer camp, if you will, or one of my colleagues described it from his vantage point. He was talking to another psychologist. It seems, specifically in the special operations community, it's become a rite of passage. And I don't know if it's because of the podcast world or just the way people have described it. It's, hey, I've gone down to Mexico, did my treatment, and now everything's sunshine and rainbows. And I think, to your point, yes, if the system and the patterns at home and the relationships at home don't change, then you and I have both seen individuals that have done the revolving door. They've done that. They've come back and they're going back out doing contract or work or whatever, but nothing's really changed. And in 6 months, they're reporting back like, hey, I need to go back to Mexico
Yes.
for another treatment, as well as individuals that I'm sure you've had and I've had as well, that it's almost like, well, if I retire, like I've got to go down and do my ibogaine treatment because this is just what we do.
Right.
So there's just a lot to, I think, clarify as a whole with some of the communication. But to your point, now I'm getting sidetracked, but to your point, really assess well if it's even a good option for the individual to potentially pursue it.
Absolutely. Like really like, what is the why? Why now? You know, I mean, that classic psychotherapy question, right? Why now? What is it about this moment in time that makes this intervention feel like it's the next best choice? And let's unpack that. You know, is it I'm going to lose my marriage? Is it I don't know how much longer I can survive if I don't? Is it, that my buddies are doing it? Is it that my wife is saying she's going to leave me if I don't do it? Like what's the why? Because that why and that entry point into the journey really matters. And it doesn't mean necessarily that like, oh, if my why is not good enough, but no, it's not that. It's about like really getting clear on what are the pain points? Where's the suffering? And then once we can understand like where the suffering is living and how it's showing up, that's when we can better prepare for like, how do we open this container? How do we choose the right container? How do we choose the right medicine, the right intervention at the right time? Open that container and then meaningfully be able to go in and do this piece of work and then find ways to very successfully integrate around that original why, while recognizing like that whys could also possibly be changing as the rubber meets the road and you come back out into the world and you've learned more about yourself and you've learned more about these experiences. But yeah, I mean, it's so heartbreaking to me when will hear or working on cases or have been a part of cases where it's like, oh no, like this was supposed to have worked. And all this hope gets placed on this one day, this one night, this one intervention. And, and all hope or despair lives or dies on that. And it's not that,
Yeah.
it's, like that is one moment in time where a door opens, but like particularly with ibogaine and 5-meo, with ibogaine, I mean, in my own experience and in coaching others, I mean, it can take about a year and to really land for everything that came up in that one day, that one night, to really land and for us to be able to take a look at it meaningfully and see what are all of these downstream effects. Because I think what the projection or the image that gets projected out there is like, yep, went down to Mexico, did this treatment, I'm like bright and shiny and new. And honestly, like I came out of my first ibogaine journey, like I'm bright and shiny and new because that is what happens, what it feels like. Like it's like it happens for a reason. We're saying it for a reason. like it comes from it comes from somewhere. And that early clearance does feel amazing. I mean, clinically, what I think is happening, we're seeing a lot of neuroinflammation reducing. We're seeing, functionality come back on board that I know for myself, I had never experienced before. I've been chronically ill. I developed Lyme disease as a very young child and had a lot of downstream effects from that, a lot of trauma, a lot of violence that I experienced. So for me, I mean, it was like brand new body, brand new experience. I've never known this state. And I think that that's what we hear a lot about in the sound bites and things. And it's a legit stage. It's a legit stage that's part of integration, but is only one stage in the integration process.
Yeah.
That's that first, 6 weeks, 2 months out. And then what I notice is the downstream effects. It's more like tectonic plates shifting. So there's like the big change, and then these slow movements of the tectonic plates of our belief systems, of the ways that we used to respond that now maybe we have more choice in. It is new ways of thinking, like novelty that comes forward that naturally gets limited when we're in states of depression and anxiety and trauma. Like suddenly novelty becomes available. We're able to consider things in a brand new way. And those are really subtle changes that reshape everything.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't know that that's also part of what's happening, we can kind of lose that mindfulness component and just get back into a workaday life, and we end up missing I don't know what to call it, like I love this phrase of hers, but she refers to them as like the Easter eggs of ibogaine. Like we end up missing out on the Easter egg hunt, because all of these little gifts are still waiting. They're all right there, just waiting to be integrated, waiting to be picked up. But if we can't recognize that, like, oh no, this is an opportunity that's actually presenting itself because it just feels so much more subtle, and because it's further out in time from when the actual journey occurred, we can actually miss that that's an opportunity to create a new pathway.
I'd love for you to tell me, now you've worked in this space for a while, your ideal. I'm going to kind of present some of the problems. We've hit on a couple, but what would be the ideal process through this? And what I mean by that is I've had clients come to me and say, hey, I want to start working, email exchange. And then within the first session, like, yeah, I signed up and I'm going down to Mexico to do ibogaine. And like my coach recommended I start therapy. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so now, even if I wanted to do the thorough assessment, right, I'm behind the eight ball because,
right.
And the coach is, obviously like, hey, this is a client, they've either paid or somebody's paying for them. And so we've jumped way ahead.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I know I'm tasked with, just with Soft Network and working with some of these organizations, is building better systems so that we've got a better communication process between treatment, the coaches, the clinician. But in an ideal world, for somebody that's listening, it's like, hey, I don't want to make any mistakes. If I want that beautiful moment, right? If I want that transformative experience, and not that we can plan it perfectly, because obviously we don't know what's going to happen when you take that medicine and how it interacts with your psyche. But
Right.
in a perfect world, what would it look like? Would they be in therapy for a while? Would they know some of their bugaboos, hiccups, triggers, things like that?
Yes.
And so kind of walk me through what you
Yeah.
think kind of that start to end would look like.
Yeah. So I think would be in therapy for a while, and have an idea of where they've been. Right. Like, I mean, I think that's really what I see that comes forward in the medicine space, is having a good idea of like, what have I experienced in my life? And not just like from this kind of like tagline that our mind can do, right? Like this is a cognitive feature that our mind does, where it's like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna like umbrella everything, these things happen. But no, like really, what has impacted me, and at which times in my life, what is really going to be coming forward? Because in the medicine space, sometimes it's very direct. Sometimes it can be literal. Sometimes you're going to see, I don't know, like I'll walk back into a scene of a childhood experience I had. But other times it's much more symbolic, or there might be no visions at all. I mean, that's also like in Ibogaine, um, visions are not a guarantee, and some people never have visions in ibogaine. Like it's not necessarily a standard feature of the medicine, although people often talk about it in that way. And so recognizing that, like, okay, I might have this idea, but it might show up in other ways of knowing. Like my very first journey with ibogaine, it was 36 hours of just pure physical sensation.
Hmm.
No other way of knowing of what was getting brought up, right? So no other way of making meaning in that moment of like, what is this pain? What is the discomfort? What is this that I'm going through? How do I relate to it? How do I ride this out? Like it's very physically uncomfortable.
Physical and
Um,
emotional pain, just for clarity.
so this journey, my journey number one, it was purely physical.
Okay.
So I came in with relapsing remitting MS, And I'd had a brain bleed from I was a kiddo who was shook as a kid. And so I had a brain bleed from child abuse, and was 4 months postpartum with a C-section delivery for my daughter. So for me, like that journey, that was all physical. It was all physical. I had a couple of very brief snippets of visions in the beginning. There was a really scary trauma memory that opened up, and I was able to like relate to Ibogaine and say, hey, this really scares me. I don't know if I can do this. And Ibogaine actually, back to this comment of like, is it a spirit? Ibogaine spoke back to me and said, you don't have to see this to heal it. I'll just take it away from you if you'd like. And I said, please do. And did. And so the vision went. And for the next however long that was, it was all just pure physical sensation. So, I mean, we can have these ideas that like, oh, this journey is going to like unlock something really powerful for me, or I'm going to get this visual validation or this confirmation, and that might happen, but it's also just as likely that that won't happen. It's also quite possible that it could be a very physiological experience. And the healing doesn't come from the visions. And I think that's the piece where people can get stuck, especially if they've never had a psychedelic experience before, or they have these expectations and ideas of how other medicines might, like how psilocybin might be compared to ibogaine, or how ketamine might be compared to another medicine. So I think it's having that cross education that it can show up in all of these ways.
Okay.
And that it's more about how we're relating to ourselves, our emotions, our experiences, and what arises within us that really determines the success or the challenge that we'll have coming out of that journey, and the success or challenges that we'll have in that integration.
So ideally they're in therapy. Ideally, what I'm hearing you say is ideally they have a map of where they've been, some of the traumas. Maybe they haven't done extensive trauma work, but they at least have a good map of, hey, I was abused in this situation, and this, had this consequences. Maybe I'm not completely healed, but they've got a good map of who they are psychologically, physically, maybe even as well, injuries, when they're going in there. And so maybe, like you said, they've been in therapy a while, they've got some tools, they've got a map. And then at some point, whether it's their choice or, buddy introduces them, whatever, they decide, hey, I'm going to, pursue psychedelics, whether that's ayahuasca, ibogaine, fill in the blank. What, in your professional opinion, what should be happening next once, they reach out to an organization, get vetted, get approved for funding, all of that, and they get a coach? What should the conversation or communication be like between the clinician and, I'll say, the coach? What does that next step look like?
I mean, so it's not the way the system is currently set up. But I would say, like in most ideal world, we're having a conversation. So, I mean, like me as the clinician, I would love to be hopping on a call with the coach, fielding and really just having a collaborative call. Ideally, the client's in on that call as well. And we're all talking about this together of like, here's where Chris and I have been working, the things that we've been looking at. And here's, you would be sharing, like, here's what I'm really hoping to get out of this experience. And then we're all collaborating together to help walk you into that container and that space. And then there's that ongoing collaboration with you on the backside as the therapist to understand, like, how did the journey go? What were the experiences that happened? Were there any challenging experiences that came up, and how was that handled? Ideally, that should be happening every step of the way, right? So like even from the retreat center, reaching out to the coach if the coaches aren't on site with the client, like, we want to make sure that that person is held, that their experience is held, that their narrative is held throughout, and that nothing gets missed. And then on the backside, I think that looks like, working with the coach around those integration components as they've identified for that piece of the work that they're doing. I really consider it in terms of these larger networks of support, similar to like psychotherapy, right? Like if you and your spouse are going to see your couples therapist, but you're seeing me for trauma therapy, like we have our own lanes that we're working within, but we all should be in communication with each other about what's going on, especially if we're at you're at a moment where you're going through a bigger intervention, right? So I would want to be like connecting with a coach and better understanding, how did the journey go? What have you guys been working on? How can I support that? Where do you see, like, me as a clinician, more skill set? Where are you outside of your skill set? And then where can I lean in to help support and bolster this process further?
In your opinion, if the clinician has like a MAPS training or some sort of additional certification and or training, is it necessary to have a coach?
Hmm. I think it depends on how competent the clinician feels in the process.
Okay.
So like for me, for myself, like I cross over both in coaching and psychotherapy. And so I feel comfortable and confident walking on both sides of the street there. But I think it really comes down to the clinician and how skilled do they feel in supporting that medicine, right? So, like some of the therapists I work with who are working with ketamine assisted therapy and maybe have been for a number of years, like, yeah, that they totally feel comfortable and confident um, walking their client through that process. If they're going to a treatment site where they require their own coaches, maybe there's collaboration that's happening there, but it's all within scope. But I would say if it's starting to move into like medicines that are outside of scope, right? So like maybe somebody did do, I don't know, I'm thinking of like Integrative Psychiatry Institute, like their year-long training where you're surveying over a number of medicines. Well, yeah, there's an ibogaine training that's in there, but it's only, it's maybe like a day's worth of a training.
Hmm.
Do you really feel competent as a clinician to say like, oh yes, I can clinically work with somebody who's going through an ibogaine journey? Like, do you feel like you have the skill set um, and really the collaborator? Do you have somebody you can go to if you think like, okay, yes, I do feel like I'm competent to be able to walk this person in? And say you get in there, do you have a network that you can lean back into if somebody's coming to you and having these challenging experiences on the backside that maybe you just haven't been exposed to just due to a lack of experience?
Okay, so they're in therapy. They ideally have a good map of who they are, where they come from, some of their pressure points. The clinician and the coach collaborate through treatment and then into the integration phase so that there's not really any crossing of streams. Everybody's kind of in their own parallel world. That system, I know that system is we're trying to ensure that system takes place with our two partners whenever we have clients that are crossing over with heroic hearts and vets. That's something that's we've been very purposeful to work towards. I know we've talked about clients that didn't get screened well. We've talked about clients that go and experience the summer high, but nothing changes when they get home. What are and maybe it's one of these things that we've hit on, but what do you see as kind of the biggest gap or lack of system to date when it surrounds individuals pursuing psychedelic treatment?
Yeah. Um, I would say it's really understanding the tail of the integration.
Okay.
That's integration has a long tail.
Okay.
And I would say that where I've seen, hmm, yeah, I would say it's that piece. And I and the hard thing is that we always want folks to have autonomy, right? We always want folks to understand, like, yep, you can engage in care or not engage in care for as long as you choose to. What I think is missing is the education around, and I don't even know how to do this yet. Like, I don't know how to name it. I don't know what the language needs to be. I don't know how we get the information across to let folks know that like we really do need to be holding and tracking this over the course of time. So I don't know if it's structurally setting this up as like doing like monthly integration calls or something like that for a year out, or whatever that structure needs to look like. But the integration takes way longer than I think people recognize. And then I think there are a lot of missed opportunities to really deepen into the healing that can take place, and a lot of like self criticism and blame and shame and all kinds of other stuff that comes up when that isn't highlighted.
Mm.
I'm thinking of somebody I have was in conversation with, and this person has gone to ayahuasca more than 60 ceremonies. 60 ceremonies. And his comment was like, I'll get good for a little bit, and then it all just keeps, it all just crashes back in. So then he, just keeps, I think, this kind of like revolving door of going back to medicine, going back to medicine, going back to medicine. And really what I keep coming back to is this recognition that like ingestion does not equal integration. It can seem like it does. And for the window of time where we have the greatest, clearance, where the medicine itself is actively still working, whether we're in that 30 days out or that 60 days out, or with Ibogaine like 90 days out, where those levels are still really high, it can feel like, okay, like this is just the new me. And it's like, well, it is. It's the new you, but it's the new you with the medicine still, like some downstream effect is still on board. And then that is going to diminish, and the body's going to finish using up whatever those, metabolites are that were produced from that medicine. And that come down is going to happen. And it's like the lights get turned down, it seems like so gently that you don't necessarily even realize that that's what's happening. And then people will find themselves, like similar to this guy, like back in the state of like, okay, now I need to go find another ayahuasca ceremony. So we end up chasing, I think, the openings that these medicines can offer. We don't have enough awareness that the time limit of it is different. It's not, it can feel like, I apologize. I'm not naming this well.
No, you're good. I'm getting, and maybe this is on target, maybe not. I'm getting this mental picture that we all have rooms in our head, and I quite literally mean like a living room. Imagine a living room in your head, and we need to move the furniture. The furniture are the dynamics with our marriage, the dynamics with maybe a past trauma, fill in the blank, and that furniture is heavy. And psychedelics specifically elevate the furniture, if you think anti-gravity, and which feels amazing, right? Because the pressure, the weight is totally different. And then almost like helium coming out of a balloon, they are coming down, and you have a limited amount of time to reorganize that furniture, and you're not really aware when gravity fully kicks in. But if you don't rearrange that furniture the way you want it, with some level of focus and intentionality and speed, things are just going to settle back down.
Exactly. It's going to go right, maybe not exactly where it was before. You can never step in the same river twice, but I mean, the way we do one thing is the way we do everything. And if we don't change the way that we do the one thing, like the furniture is going to be right back where it was.
Yeah. Now that tracks, sorry, I'm constantly, I obviously as an educator thinking of simplistic ways to pass information along to students and break down complex stuff and disseminate it. But I think for me, and this is more for me, I'm just processing out loud. Aaron Wolfgang, he's a psychiatrist for active duty, and he was a presenter at SOCOM's Care Coalition conference a couple of years ago there in Orlando, and I've referenced this before, but his point in his presentation was we need to start thinking about psychedelics as the anesthesia to surgery being the therapy. Like it's the precursor, they go together.
Yes.
And I think I kind of understood that, but for whatever reason, what you were just saying in that word picture of the furniture made a lot more sense to me. And so how do we, and maybe it's you, Lyndsey, like I would say from the clinician standpoint and somebody that's in this world, but adjacent, right? Especially with the special operations community, is how do we get a standardized training so that the clinicians themselves are acutely aware of, hey, we're gravity's kicking in and we know what to do with efficiency. And I know we're still in that infancy stage of like, hey, does the medicine work? But, my 30,000 foot lens is like, okay, we need a standardized training that can be delivered to clinicians and have similar, maybe like EMDR in the sense of consultation calls so that they can be spun up and feel competent, aware, so that if individuals are going with the speed of which they're pursuing these medications, if there's anything on the provider end that we're missing, we're closing that loophole. We can't control what's going on with the coaches and different things, and doing obviously a better job of assessment and making sure the client's not, just running off to summer camp and experiencing the high and then coming back and nothing's changed. But is there anything else that you see as a system that we kind of need in the here and now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely is the first step. So are you framing in terms of like general counselor education or counselors who are specifically considering counseling around psychedelic medicines?
Yeah, I would think, I don't know what MAPS right now costs, and that's kind of the gold standard, if you will, but it was like $9,000 back in, I think, 2020, and you had to go through with a male, female, and that was still with the clinical trials. I don't think it cost that much, but there's such a volume between, and I'm just naming, Heroic Hearts, Vet Solutions, Ambio, Mission Within, and I know there's some cross pollination of some of individuals historically there, but there is so much volume.
Yeah.
In my professional estimation, and this is working with individuals that work with special operations fairly regularly, there's not enough education around that.
No.
And so, yeah, I would say, hey, we need some sort of at cost or lower cost where you can, I'm speaking to you, but you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
There is enough education and consultation so that with the volume that's coming through, if we're losing 35%, and I'm just using, whatever round numbers, we can shrink that down to 15%, because the providers are catching, hey, the furniture's coming down and we need to move quickly here, and we know what to do.
Well, and truly, and I think like that intervention, I think that's a different tool, right? I don't think it's the same as like the MAPS training or IPI or like some of these, like, I don't think it has to be
Right.
that big lift. I think like those big lift trainings make sense if you want to be the counselor that's supporting in the medicine.
Right.
Like, if you want to be the facilitator, if you want to be a psychological support during that component, I think this level of education could be more of like a semester course and really just like a survey of like, here are the medicines, here are the places to go if you want to learn more about, the biology of what's going on, the pharmacology of what's going on. Like, I don't think it has to be like to that level
Right.
for this level of a course, but to have a better understanding for therapists around, here are the risk factors going in, here are ways to talk about these medicines if people are bringing them forward. Here are the hard no's for each of the types of medicine that people might be wanting to experience. And then here are those critical windows. I think that's really the pieces. What are the critical windows per medicine? And then how do we actually activate that as effectively as possible?
Yeah, we need those mile markers as they're moving through, and we need somebody that is competent and been living in this space long enough to be like, hey, here's a mile marker, here's what you need to have done or be prepared for in that. And going back to your comment, hey, it takes about a year to really do it well. Well, to your point, if I'm working with a client, and yes, we may be doing EMDR or fill in the blank, the coaches who may have a little bit more training, they're limited to, many times these organizations, they've only got funding for like 5 to 7 coaching sessions. And I mean, that goes quick. And now we're missing these mileposts that you're talking about that at the end of the day would serve the client and serve us, because then they're not weighing down, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but our caseload.
Right.
because they're moving forward and they're getting to a point where they're autonomous to a certain degree. You know, all therapists should be moving, you know, their clients to hopefully become autonomous without us.
Yes.
We should just be the lifeguards that they check in every once in a while.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and to that point, I mean, I think that's exactly it. And I think that's where the market, like this is where the market, I think, is trying to find its way, right? Like there's this distance between, here's what the programs are able to support and what people are able to afford, and there's a gap between that and what we know of as best practice and what we know of as like those downstream effects. And I think that's really where this education piece comes in. And I don't know what the asset looks like yet. Is it a training? Obviously, I think it's training for counselors and needs to just be woven in as part of general counselor education at this point. I mean,
Yeah.
it's with ketamine being out as long as it has been. Like I'm even in Colorado, where it's been very commonly used for a number of years now. Insurance has covered it for many years here. I'm still like shocked when I get on a call with somebody and they have no reference point to it.
Yeah.
None. Or they'll have somebody coming to them saying, "Hey, I think I want to do this," and they don't have any education around it, or they have miseducation around it. So I think ensuring that we all have like that shared clinical competency is really important, so that we can at least talk about these things openly because they're coming into our spaces. But then also having that education around those critical windows and really like how to weave into them best. I mean, I think any treatment that has a bottom up approach, in terms of like evidence-based approaches, anything that's moving in a bottom up approach when somebody's on the backside of psychedelics, always going to be tremendous because that's the part of the body that we're really accessing most openly. And so those will be the interventions I would always recommend leaning in on, but also recognizing like there's still a person who, it's your client, right? So they may
Right.
not necessarily organize around that. And so that's where the psychoeducation piece comes in being able to like teach our clients, like, here's actually what's happening. Like, as we're removing this default mode network, as we're taking this part of the mind offline for, minutes to many hours, here's really what's happening in this channel. Here's how we can start trying to make meaning out of what's coming through, and here's how we can best support your body and your nervous system as you're walking right back out of this. That basic kind of education where clinicians can feel comfortable and confident having those conversations, and then the containers for consultation, where people can drop in. I mean, I keep picturing it almost as just like having open office hours. And those of us who've been doing this work for a while, like being able to create those containers and spaces where people can come in with these questions, because we really don't have like a formal system to help support it yet. I think we're coming to craft that, but I don't know what that's going to look like and how long it's going to take for us to get there. But having those spaces where clinicians can come and no shame, no anything, like let's just openly talk about,
Yeah.
what are the questions that are coming up? Where are those blocks?
Yeah, one of the things that we do at Soft Network specifically is we have an open signal chat for all of our providers
Awesome.
to ask questions about anything. It could be, now a lot of times it's resources, but sometimes, it's, hey, what are the, I'm not read up on some of the best fill in the blank. Could be shame literature, like who's got some great books on that, and boom. But something like that, what you're describing, where there's education, but then there's an opportunity where there's some level of either peer-to-peer consultation or just general consultation where they can continually regularly check in, like we were talking about earlier before we jumped on. I think that's one of the bugaboos and the deficits of our profession is we're in silos.
Yes.
And not social media, specifically COVID helped move people into being okay with telehealth, which has been awesome for so many of our clients.
Yeah.
But I think it's further isolated the clinician that used to be in a private practice with 3 other people. And now
Yes.
economically it doesn't make sense. I can just work from home and have my own private practice and website, but now they're siloed off. And unless they've got a network of clinicians that they're really close with, they're not going to reach out. And so I think there's got to be a component where they can be vulnerable and ask the questions that they just don't know about.
And that's exactly it. And and letting that all be okay. I think that piece around, I don't know, we talk about imposter syndrome, like it's in the therapy world and the counseling world. And it's totally it's okay to not know. Just really wanting to like honor
Yes.
and like name, like it's okay to not know. It's okay to bring forward any of these questions, because this is how we keep people safe. This is how we maintain safety in this field. I think the siloed experience, whether we're talking about it in a like siloed because of technology, siloed because our culture has changed, siloed because sometimes that's what people do for shame protection. Like
Yeah.
people build silos for different reasons, and systems don't thrive in silos. They
Mm.
never do. They suffocate. And so, our best shot at being able to ensure that nobody suffocates in this process, that we have open communication, that we have clear line of sight, that we're understanding and learning from each other. Really, like, what does best preparation look like? What does best integration look like? What does that look like based on the person coming in and their demographic? Does that matter? I mean, like, there's so much that I think we still have the ability, so much to learn. And if we aren't finding ways to do this collaboratively, we've, it's, I don't know, it's the same as like missing out on the Easter eggs vibe again,
Mm.
right? Like we can have all of these jewels, all of this wisdom that's seeded out into the world. And if we don't have a way to meaningfully access it and integrate it into our own knowing, our own understanding, our own clinical practice, and then our own communities of counseling and support, um, everyone loses. Everyone loses.
Absolutely. Well, I know you got to go. I got to go here in a second. Gosh, we could talk
Mhm.
about so much more. Thank you so
Yes.
much, Lyndsey.
Thanks,
This has been
Chris.
awesome. I have so wanted since literally 2018 to sit down and start this series of conversations because it's so important. We're, like I said, in such an early phase of this development. And I just believe if clinicians are honest and we talk about some of the things we don't know, some of the things we're concerned about, some of the successes, and to your point, we didn't even hit on it, but we're going to have a provider come in and talk about some of the physiological healing, not just psychological, the physiological healing. And I know you touched on it a little bit with your own story.
Yeah.
That's been happening. We got to get this information out there. And I think as clinicians, we got to talk about it. Real quick, do you have any contact information? If somebody wants to get a hold of you, can we put it in the show notes? Do you have anything like that we can point them to?
Oh, yeah. Feel free to send them over to my website, embodiedillumination.org.
Okay.
And that has all my contact materials, or you can catch me on LinkedIn as well.
Awesome. Anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
I just want to thank you for doing this, both for the SOF network and everyone who will get to hear this talk in this way, but also for the counselors that you're bringing up in education. I mean, truly, like as another therapist in the field, what you're doing matters, and it's really, really, really important. So thank you for helping to set the stage for all of these new clinicians who are coming up, and we're happy to welcome them in over on this side.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've been pounding this drum. When I saw that first client, literally, I wasn't even done with my PhD, but I happened to be doing an internship and a teaching internship that semester, and absolutely asked the professor, like, hey, can I talk about what I just experienced? And it's been a drum I've been beating for a long time, because it's so important. And I would also say the young clinicians, they're so hungry. They're seeing this information on social media and they want the education. To your point, I think it's got to get in the grad schools at some point, because I think it may not be the next thing, but it is one of the most important next things, I believe, that's happening in our field. And it needs to be discussed in important places, especially for the young clinicians coming up.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and I guess I will just plug, I do have a book that's going to be coming out this fall through PESI.
Nice.
We're still working on the title, but it's on ketamine assisted therapy and healing developmental trauma through ketamine assisted therapy. And so that's really where I'm picking up a lot of these components for new clinicians coming into the space to really understand, like, what is this medicine physiologically? How is it working? Psychologically, what is it bringing forward? how do we use both the, the gifts of what comes forward? How do we create the protections and really just support folks in being able to walk out of specifically around developmental trauma as successfully as possible?
Awesome. Well, will you please let me know, shoot me an email whenever that's accessible, because we'll definitely plug it on our LinkedIn
Thanks, Chris.
page and let everybody know, as far as within our network of clinicians as well, to check it out. But Lyndsey, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. Such an honor to be here today. And thank you for all that you're doing to bring this out into the world.
Absolutely.